The year was
Everyone
1888,
called
and the
his
wind
round
bit
stone
hard
cabin
across the
useless,
newly settled plains
until
of the
winter
American
would
West.
decide the truth.
Here, where the vast sky met an endless horizon, a small, resilient community had begun to carve out a life. Log cabins, sturdy and familiar, dotted the landscape, each one a testament to hard work and shared wisdom. Building with logs was the way things were done. Everyone knew it, everyone understood it, until Lars arrived. Lars was a man of quiet demeanor, his eyes carrying the distant look of someone who had seen colder, harsher lands. He had journeyed from the northern reaches of Scandinavia, bringing with him a resolve as unyielding as the frozen ground he once tilled. He wasn't loud, nor did he boast. He simply observed, listened, and then, to the bewilderment of his new neighbors, he began to do things differently. He wasn't a stranger to hard labor. His hands, calloused and strong, spoke of years spent wrestling with the earth, but his methods, his choices, they were peculiar. In a settlement where every axe swing echoed the promise of a new log home, Lars began to gather stones, not just small stones, but large, irregular boulders, pulled from the riverbed and dug from the stubborn soil. His wagon, heavy laden, rumbled slowly back to his chosen plot, day after day. The other settlers, men like Thomas, a respected carpenter who had built half the cabins in the valley, would pause their own work to watch. Their initial curiosity soon morphed into a quiet, then not so quiet, skepticism. "What's he building, Thomas?" one man asked, leaning on his axe handle, watching Lars struggle with a particularly large stone. Thomas, a man of few words but sharp judgment, simply shook his head. "Doesn't look like any cabin I've ever seen." "Logs are for cabins, stone is for foundations." The whispers began subtly. "He's wasting his time," someone would say. "Those stones won't keep the winter out." Others were more direct. "Lars, my friend," a farmer named Jebediah offered one afternoon, "you'll freeze solid in a stone house. Wood breathes, wood is warm." Lars would simply nod, offer a small, polite smile, and continue his arduous work. He never argued. He never tried to explain. He just kept building. What Lars understood, deep in his bones, was a principle forgotten, or perhaps never truly learned, by those accustomed to the endless forests of the plains. He knew that wood, for all its insulating properties, allowed heat to escape relatively quickly. A log cabin, once its fire died down, would cool rapidly, but stone, Lars knew, was different. Stone had a memory for heat. It absorbed warmth slowly, like a patient giant, holding on to it, and then just as slowly releasing it back into the space. It was a simple idea, a basic law of nature: thermal mass. The heavier and denser the material, the more heat it could store. And then there was the shape. Instead of the familiar square or rectangular footprint of every other home, Lars began to lay his stones in a perfect circle, a round house. This was met with even greater bewilderment. How will you fit furniture in a round room? Where will the corners be for the beds? The questions were endless, the ridicule growing more open. A round structure was an oddity, a folly, but Lars knew another simple truth. A circle had no weak points for the wind to batter against. The fierce gales that swept across the plains, notorious for finding every crack and crevice, would simply flow around a round wall. There were no corners for the wind to catch, no flat surfaces to push against with full force, and for a given internal space, a round wall had less surface area than a square one, meaning less exposure to the cold, less area for heat to escape. It was a subtle efficiency, but Lars believed it would make all the difference. His days were long, grueling affairs. He worked from dawn until dusk, his hands raw from lifting and shaping the heavy stones. He learned to mix a mortar of sand, lime and water, carefully applying it between each stone, ensuring a tight, unyielding bond. While his neighbors quickly raised their log walls, Lars's circular foundation grew at a painstaking pace. Every stone was a battle, every layer a triumph of patience over exhaustion. This wasn't just a matter of preference, it was a profound sacrifice. His young wife, Ilara, watched him with a mixture of unwavering faith and growing concern. They had limited savings, meager resources. Each day Lars spent on his peculiar stone structure was a day not spent earning wages, not spent building a more conventional and perhaps safer home for their small family before the brutal winter arrived. Their reputation in the settlement began to shift. They were no longer just the quiet newcomers, they were the odd ones, the stubborn ones. The construction costs, too, were higher. While logs were abundant and free for the taking, the lime for the mortar had to be purchased, hauled from a distant town. His tools, though simple, were specialized for stone, not wood. Every penny counted, and Lars was pouring what little they had into a project that everyone else openly dismissed as a fool's errand. He was risking not just his own comfort, but the well-being and future of his family, all for a belief in a few simple, forgotten principles. By late summer, as the first hints of autumn chill began to touch the air, the walls of Lars's round stone cabin finally began to rise above the height of a man. They were thick, nearly 2 feet across, solid and imposing. They looked nothing like the welcoming, warm log cabins around them. They looked like a fortress, perhaps, or a forgotten monument, and as the days grew shorter and the winds carried a sharper edge, the community's quiet ridicule turned into open pity. Everyone knew what was coming. The winter on the plains was unforgiving, and Lars, they believed, had built nothing more than an elaborate tomb. As autumn deepened, bringing with it a biting chill that promised a brutal winter, the other settlers hurried to complete their traditional log cabins. The sound of axes, felling trees, and hammers driving nails filled the air, a symphony of communal effort. Families worked together, neighbors helping neighbors, sharing the common knowledge passed down through generations. Everyone knew how to build a log home. Everyone understood its strengths and weaknesses. Lars, however, continued his solitary work on his round stone structure. The walls, now reaching their full height, were an undeniable presence on the landscape, a stark contrast to the rectangular log homes. They were thick, immensely so, almost 2 feet of solid rock and mortar. The sheer mass of them was impressive, even to his detractors, but still they saw it as an impracticality, a waste. Thomas, the carpenter, often walked past Lars's site on his way to help a new family finish their roof. He'd stop, lean against his wagon, and watch Lars meticulously place another stone. Thomas was a practical man, a man who respected hard work, but he couldn't reconcile what he saw with what he knew to be true about building for the winter. "Lars," Thomas said one brisk morning, his voice firm but not unkind, "those walls are solid, yes, but stone is cold. It draws the heat out of you. You'll need a roaring fire just to feel a chill, let alone warmth." Lars paused, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, and simply nodded. He didn't offer a defense, didn't explain his theories. He just acknowledged the observation, a small, knowing glint in his eye that Thomas couldn't quite decipher. It was frustrating for Thomas, this silent conviction. He wanted to help, to offer advice, but Lars seemed impenetrable in his chosen path. The community's pity for Lars and his family grew. Ilara, Lars's wife, was a graceful woman, but the strain of their situation began to show in her tired eyes. The other women would bring her small offerings, a basket of freshly baked bread, a warm shawl for the coming cold. These gestures, meant as kindness, often carried an unspoken message. "You poor dear, your husband is making a terrible mistake." Ilara would accept them with quiet dignity, never complaining, never doubting Lars aloud. Her faith in him, though silent, was absolute. Lars, meanwhile, was focused on the next critical phase, the roof. Here, too, he deviated from the norm. Instead of a simple gabled roof, he constructed a sturdy conical frame, reinforced with heavy timbers. This circular design, he reasoned, would shed snow and ice more efficiently and offer less resistance to the powerful winds. He then insulated it with layers of sod and packed earth, creating a thick, earthen cap that would add to the thermal mass and provide an extra barrier against the cold. It was an immense undertaking, requiring the hoisting of heavy timbers and countless trips to collect sod. The principle Lars was applying was still thermal mass, but also a clever understanding of insulation and wind resistance. The thick stone walls would absorb and radiate heat, but the roof was equally vital. The earthen roof, dense and heavy, would act like a blanket, slowing down the escape of heat upwards where most heat loss occurred. And the conical shape, aerodynamic by nature, was a silent defiance of the plain's notorious blizzards. His sacrifice was becoming increasingly evident. Their meager savings dwindled to almost nothing. The time spent on the cabin meant less time hunting, less time preparing for their own food stores for winter. They relied more on the kindness of neighbors, a situation that Lars found humbling but accepted with quiet gratitude. He knew he was asking a great deal of Elara and their small child, but he believed, with every fiber of his being, that it would be worth it. One evening, as the first flakes of snow began to fall, drifting lazily across the darkening sky, Lars finally finished the last touches on his cabin. It stood alone, a stout, round sentinel against the vast, empty landscape. No windows faced the prevailing north wind, only small, deeply recessed openings on the south side to catch the winter sun. The single wooden door, thick and heavily insulated, was the only break in the stone. It looked less like a home and more like a permanent fixture of the earth itself. The air grew colder with each passing hour. The wind picked up, howling its mournful song across the plains. Thomas, looking out from his own cozy log cabin, saw the faint glow of a fire in Lars's round house. He wondered with a shiver how long that fire would have to burn to keep such a stone structure warm. He imagined the vast amount of firewood Lars would need, far more than any log cabin. "Poor Lars," Thomas murmured to his wife. "He'll be burning through his woodpile in a week at this rate." The community settled into their homes, preparing for the inevitable onslaught of winter. Fires were stoked, doors were barred, and prayers were said. The first blizzard of the season was approaching, a true test of every home, every family, every decision made throughout the year. The next morning, the world was transformed. A thick blanket of snow covered everything, muffling sounds and blurring horizons. The wind, however, was far from muffled. It shrieked and roared, a relentless icy force that rattled windows and groaned against log walls. Inside the traditional cabins, families huddled closer to their hearths, adding more wood, feeling the occasional draft creep through the chinks in the logs. Lars's cabin, a unique silhouette against the white, seemed to stand unyielding. No smoke rose from its chimney that morning, a detail Thomas noted with a fresh wave of concern. Had their fire gone out? Were they already freezing? The thought sent a chill down his spine, colder than the air outside. The blizzard had truly arrived, and with it the moment of truth for Lars and his unconventional home. The risk was no longer theoretical. It was real, immediate, and potentially life-threatening. The plains winter was about to deliver its final, brutal judgment. The blizzard raged for 3 relentless days and nights. The world outside was a maelstrom of white, a furious symphony of wind and ice. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and venturing outside was a gamble with death. Inside the log cabins, life became a continuous battle against the creeping cold. Families huddled, wrapped in blankets, constantly feeding their fires. The familiar warmth of the hearth was a fleeting comfort, quickly dissipating as the wind found every tiny crack and seam in the wooden walls. Thomas, like many others, found himself waking in the pre-dawn darkness to a biting chill. The fire, which had been roaring just hours before, was reduced to embers. He would stumble out of bed, shivering, and add more logs, coaxing the flames back to life. The amount of firewood they were consuming was alarming. His meticulously stacked pile, meant to last the entire winter, was visibly shrinking. He worried about his neighbors, about the elderly, and especially about Lars. The lack of smoke from Lars's chimney had become a nagging thought, a silent alarm bell in his mind. Meanwhile, inside Lars's round stone cabin, a different reality unfolded. The thick stone walls, which had been absorbing the sun's warmth and the heat from their small cooking fire for weeks, were now slowly, steadily releasing it. The air within was calm, still, and surprisingly mild. The howling winds outside, which battered the log homes with relentless force, simply flowed around the smooth, curved exterior of Lars's dwelling. There were no corners for the wind to catch, no flat surfaces to push against. The conical earthen roof shed the heavy snow, preventing accumulation and maintaining its insulating properties. Ilara and Lars's child slept soundly through the night, tucked into their simple bed. There was no need for layers of extra blankets, no need for the constant stoking of a roaring fire. A modest fire in their small, central hearth, fed sparingly, was enough to maintain a comfortable temperature. The stone walls, cool to the touch on the outside, radiated a gentle, pervasive warmth inward. It was a warmth that didn't fluctuate wildly, but remained remarkably consistent, like a gentle, steady breath. Lars would rise in the morning, not to a freezing room, but to an environment where the temperature had dropped only a few degrees from the previous evening. He would add a few small pieces of wood to the embers, and the fire would quickly catch, its heat immediately absorbed, and then slowly dispersed by the surrounding stone. They used perhaps a quarter of the firewood their neighbors were consuming, a fact that would have been unbelievable to anyone outside. The sound inside was also profoundly different. The thick walls and earthen roof muffled the blizzard's roar to a distant whisper. The cabin was a sanctuary of quiet, a peaceful haven amidst the tempest. Ilara found herself able to read, to mend clothes, and to simply exist in a state of calm that was unimaginable in the other homes, where the constant battle against the cold and the noise of the storm created a perpetual state of unease. On the fourth morning, the storm finally began to relent. The wind softened its howl to a moan, and the snowfall eased to a gentle drift. By midday, the clouds began to break, revealing a pristine, snow-covered world bathed in brilliant but deceptive sunlight. The air was crisp, clear, and brutally cold, far colder than it had been during the blizzard itself. The temperature had plunged, a common occurrence after a major storm, dropping well below zero. As the settlers emerged from their cabins, stiff and weary, they began the arduous task of shoveling snow and checking on their livestock. The first thing Thomas did was look towards Lars's cabin. To his surprise, a thin wisp of smoke now curled lazily from its chimney, a sign of life, a sign of warmth. But the sheer lack of it during the storm still puzzled him. How could they have survived without a constant fire? Later that day, driven by a mixture of concern and growing curiosity, Thomas decided to visit Lars. The walk was difficult, the snow deep and unbroken. As he approached the round stone cabin, he noticed something else unusual. While his own cabin and every other log structure was covered in a thick layer of frost and ice, Lars's walls were remarkably clear. The stone, warmer than the outside air, had prevented the ice from forming. The conical roof, too, was relatively clear of snow, having shed it efficiently. He knocked on the heavy wooden door. After a moment, Lars opened it, a small smile on his face. Behind him, Thomas could see Ilara knitting by the hearth, her child playing quietly on the floor. The air that wafted out was not a blast of heat, as from a roaring fire, but a gentle, pervasive warmth, a comfortable temperature that surprised Thomas deeply. "Lars," Thomas said, his voice a little hoarse from the cold, "I was worried. We didn't see much smoke from your chimney during the storm." Lars simply gestured for him to come in. Thomas stepped inside, stamping the snow from his boots. The difference was immediate and profound. The air was still, warm, and remarkably quiet. He could still hear the faint whisper of the wind, but it was distant, muted. He felt the warmth emanating from the stone walls, a solid, comforting presence. There was a small fire burning in the hearth, but it was modest, nothing like the roaring infernos he and his neighbors had maintained for days. "We kept a small fire," Lars explained, his voice calm, "just enough to keep the stone warm. The walls, they remember the heat." Thomas looked around, a new understanding dawning on him. He felt the thick, solid walls, the quiet, the steady warmth. He saw the small pile of firewood, surprisingly large given the duration of the storm. The solutions he and his community had relied on for generations, the traditional log cabin, had struggled mightily against this blizzard. But Lars, the quiet outsider, with his round stone house, had found a different way. The reality of the plains winter had delivered its judgment, and to Thomas's astonishment, Lars had been proven right. Thomas stayed in Lars's cabin for a long time that day, far longer than he had intended. He sat by the modest fire, feeling the steady warmth emanating from the stone walls. He listened to the quiet, the muted sounds of the world outside, and watched Ilara and her child, serene and comfortable. It was an experience that challenged everything he thought he knew about survival on the plains. He noticed the small details. The deeply set windows, designed to minimize heat loss while still allowing light in. The heavy, insulated door, which sealed shut with a satisfying thud, blocking out any drafts. The way the air moved within the round space, creating a gentle circulation without cold spots. It was clear that every element of the cabin had been designed with a purpose, a profound understanding of the environment. When Thomas finally stood to leave, a new respect was etched on his face. "Lars," he began, his voice softer than usual, I was wrong. We all were. This is truly remarkable." It was a rare admission for Thomas, a man who prided himself on his building knowledge. Lars simply nodded, a gentle smile his only response, no hint of triumph or pride. He had never sought validation, only to build a home that worked. The word spread quickly through the small community, not through Lars, who remained as quiet and unassuming as ever, but through Thomas. He visited other families, sharing his experience, describing the warmth and quiet of the stone cabin. At first, there was skepticism, then disbelief, but Thomas's reputation was unblemished. He was a man of his word, a respected builder. If Thomas said it, it had to be true. Days later, as the brutal cold snap persisted, the true cost of the blizzard became clear for many families. Some had run perilously low on firewood, forced to venture out in sub-zero temperatures to chop more, risking frostbite and exhaustion. Others had suffered minor illnesses from the constant cold within their homes. The traditional log cabins, for all their familiarity, had struggled. Thomas, now a quiet advocate for Lars's design, decided to gather some concrete evidence. He took a simple thermometer, the kind used for measuring outdoor temperatures, and began a small, unofficial survey. He first measured the temperature inside his own log cabin. It was a respectable 60 degrees Fahrenheit, but only after he had been stoking the fire heavily for hours. He then visited Jebediah's cabin, finding it at a chilly 55 degrees, the fire struggling to keep pace with the cold. Finally, he went to Lars's cabin. Inside, the thermometer read a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and the most astonishing part, the fire in Lars's hearth was barely more than embers, a small, gentle warmth, not a roaring blaze. The stone, Thomas realized, was doing the work. The thermal mass principle, which Lars had understood instinctively, was now a tangible, measurable reality. He also made a rough calculation of firewood consumption. He knew his own family had burned through at least a cord of wood during the 3-day blizzard and the subsequent cold snap. Jebediah had used even more due to a less efficient fireplace. Lars, by his own humble estimate, had used less than a quarter of a cord. This was not just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of survival economics. Firewood was precious, hard won. Lars's cabin was saving him immense labor and resources. The proof was undeniable. The round stone cabin, once mocked as a useless folly, had not just survived the winter's harshest test. It had outperformed every other home in the settlement. It was warmer, quieter, and consumed significantly less fuel. The reality of the plains winter had judged, and Lars, the quiet outsider, had been unequivocally vindicated. The community began to look at Lars differently. The pity and ridicule faded, replaced by a growing respect, tinged with a little awe. They saw not just a man who had built an odd house, but a man who had understood something fundamental about their shared environment, something they had overlooked. One evening, a group of men gathered at Thomas's cabin. Thomas, one of them, a farmer named Silas, asked, "How did he know? How did Lars know this would work?" Thomas paused, looking into the fire. He didn't just know, Silas. He understood. He understood how stone holds heat, how a circle sheds wind. It's not magic, it's just nature understood deeply. The conversation turned from idle curiosity to serious inquiry. They talked about the principles Lars had employed, the thermal mass of the stone, the aerodynamic shape of the circle, the insulating properties of the earthen roof. They began to see the logic in what had once seemed absurd. The following spring, as the snow melted and the ground softened, a few of the more adventurous settlers approached Lars. They didn't ask him to build their homes, but they asked for his guidance. They wanted to understand the principles, to learn from his quiet wisdom. Lars, without fanfare or expectation, shared what he knew. He explained the importance of thick walls, of strategic window placement, of the benefits of a round structure in a windy climate. He showed them how to mix a strong mortar, how to lay stones for stability. The knowledge began to spread, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. It wasn't about abandoning log cabins entirely, but about integrating Lars's insights. Some began to build stone foundations that extended higher, providing more thermal mass. Others experimented with round outbuildings or incorporated thicker, more insulated walls. Lars never claimed credit, never boasted. He simply continued his life, his quiet family now living in undeniable comfort and security. The plains had taught a harsh lesson, and Lars had provided an unexpected answer. His quiet wisdom, once scoffed at, was now becoming a cornerstone of their survival. The following years saw a subtle but significant shift in the building practices of the plains settlement. Lars's round stone cabin, once an anomaly, became a point of reference, a silent teacher on the landscape. While log cabins remained common, especially for those with ready access to timber, many new structures began to incorporate elements of Lars's design. Farmers, remembering the brutal winter and the comfort Lars's family had enjoyed, started building their root cellars and storage sheds with thick stone walls, noticing how these structures maintained a more stable temperature, keeping produce from freezing in winter and spoiling in summer. A few adventurous souls, inspired by Lars's success, even began to construct their own smaller round stone dwellings, often as annexes or specialized workshops. Thomas, the carpenter, became a quiet proponent of these new methods. He didn't abandon his craft of log building, but he began to integrate stone foundations that rose higher, providing more thermal mass to traditional wooden homes. He learned from Lars how to properly lay stone, how to mix mortar that would endure the harsh climate. He saw the tangible benefits: homes that were warmer in winter, cooler in summer, and more resilient against the relentless plains winds. The technique, born of necessity and a deep understanding of natural principles, didn't spread like wildfire, but rather like a steady, deep current. It wasn't a revolution, but an evolution. People didn't suddenly tear down their log homes, but when new construction was needed, or when repairs were made, Lars's wisdom influenced their choices. The most noticeable change was in the amount of firewood consumed by the settlement. Over time, the collective woodpiles seemed to last longer, a testament to improved insulation and thermal efficiency across the community. Lars, true to his nature, never sought recognition. He continued to live a quiet life with Ilara and their growing family. His cabin remained a testament to his foresight, a symbol of quiet resilience. He would occasionally offer advice when asked, always with humility and without judgment. He never said, "I told you so." The reality of the climate, the undeniable comfort within his stone walls, and the visible savings in firewood spoke for themselves. His story became a local legend, passed down through generations. It wasn't about a hero who conquered nature, but about a man who understood it, who worked with it rather than against it. It was a story about observation, about patience, and about the quiet power of simple principles. The principles Lars applied, thermal mass, aerodynamics, and efficient insulation, are still fundamental in modern sustainable building. Architects and engineers today design homes with these same ideas in mind, seeking to create structures that are in harmony with their environment, reducing energy consumption and increasing comfort. They call it passive solar design or highly efficient building envelopes. Lars, in his remote plains settlement, had intuitively grasped these concepts over a century ago. His round stone cabin stood for decades, long after many of the original log homes had succumbed to the elements or been replaced. It weathered countless blizzards, scorching summers, and the passage of time, a solid, enduring structure that seemed to grow organically from the earth itself. It was a tangible reminder that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes not from tradition or popular opinion, but from a quiet individual who dares to observe, to think differently, and to trust in the fundamental laws of nature. The story of Lars and his cabin is a timeless one. It reminds us that often the answers we seek are not complex or hidden, but are right before us, waiting to be rediscovered through careful observation and a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. It's a testament to the power of a simple, elegant solution in the face of overwhelming challenges. In a world often quick to dismiss what it doesn't immediately understand, Lars's quiet triumph serves as a powerful lesson. Sometimes the madman who goes against the grain is simply the one who sees the truth more clearly and whose quiet conviction ultimately proves to be the greatest wisdom of all. His legacy was not a monument, but a quiet, enduring understanding of how to live in harmony with the natural world, a wisdom etched in stone and remembered in the warmth of a winter's night.